Chapter 20 of Wanderings in New South Wales, Batavia, Pedir Coast, Singapore and China, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Wanderings in New South Wales, Batavia, Pedir Coast, Singapore and China, Volume 1 by George Bennett. Chapter 20. On the afternoon of the following day, we had the honour of a visit from the young Rajah. He came off in one of the large native boats, seated upon a platform on the stern, in the Oriental fashion. Having no state boat, he came in this, which was merely one of the usual cargo, or fishing boats, which are large and spacious, with a small deck or platform at the after part. Many of the rowers were attired in scarlet jackets, some having, and others being deficient in, sleeves, and all seemed to have dressed themselves in their best apparel. All wore elegant krises, for the whole of the natives, whether of the Malay or Hindostani races, wear the kris or the klawang, a kind of short sword, and are seldom or never seen without. The manufacture of these weapons varies in both the blades and handles, and all the varieties are designated by distinct native names. From the form of the blades, severe wounds must be caused by them, and many of the natives wore scars obtained by them in their private quarrels. The handles were formed of whale's teeth or buffalo horn, and the sheaths of various beautiful woods, of which a kind of satin wood seemed to have the preference. The wood is said not to be luted together, nor has it the appearance of being so, in the construction of the sheath, but is hollowed in an ingenious manner from a solid piece, and is very liable to split with the least blow. They are tastefully ornamented with a kind of tatauing, or carving, performed with a small knife, into which, after the carving is completed, some black pigment is rubbed, which gives an increased effect to the decoration. They place a high value on the krises and klawangs, and they are usually ornamented with gold or silver, according to the rank and wealth of the owner. The cutting portion of the blade is formed of steel, the remainder of iron. The temper of the weapons is not good, being extremely brittle. The Rajah was attired in the same apparel as on our interview yesterday, but his followers formed, in dress, a motley group. There was a fine-looking lad, about 14 years of age, who came with the party. He was step-brother to the Rajah, or, as we were informed by a Mormon who spoke some English, one father, two mothers, Rajah, and this boy. He was dressed in a scarlet jacket, decorated with gold lace, a handsome kris, and wore gold bangles around his ankles. The young Rajah ran about the ship, seeming to enjoy all he beheld, mistook the Sow, who behaved remarkably well on this occasion, neither grunting nor giving any indications of the suspicious family to which she belonged, but sat upon her haunches, gazing unmeaningly at the visitors, who held her race in abhorrence, for a kind of dog, and was delighted with the turkeys, which he had never seen before. A pair of the birds were presented to him, and also a sheep, at which he was much gratified. Our thin spare friend, the trading minister, and also a train of attendants and merchants, accompanied the Rajah. The former antiquated personage brought with him his son, a little boy of about 4 or 5 years old. He was a keen, black-eyed little fellow, wore a Mormon's cap elegantly worked with gold lace on his little shaved cranium. a scarlet jacket and trousers, a number of gold and silver bangles about his wrists and ankles, and an amulet or charm which consists of a sentence from the Quran written and placed in a case to protect the wearer from injury. The priests make it a good harvest in this kind of traffic, which appears to me strictly analogous to the African fetishes. Pended from his neck. The dark, diminutive creature chattered incessantly, and was inquisitive about everything it saw, appeared devoid of fear, and was quite tame, suffering itself to be handled with impunity. After all our sable visitors had concluded their rambles over, and inspection of, the ship, they were invited into the cuddy. Seated round the table, and cabin biscuit and cheese were placed before them. They evinced some partiality to the former, by devouring large quantities themselves, and passing supplies to the numerous attendants who could not feed at the table. They could not be induced thus publicly to taste wine or beer, being against the Mahometan creed, but preferred cocoa-nut water, which they said is our wine and beer. But few would refuse either wine or spirits in private. I amused them with some drawings. Among others, they recognized that of the pearly Nautilus, but said it was rarely procured at this place, but was occasionally seen off the coast. They named it sea shrimp, udang laut, udang shrimp, and laut sea. They were not acquainted with the orangutan, of which I showed them an engraving, but immediately knew that of the Hybolates syndactyla, or Ungca ape, which, they observed, was found in the woods of the interior of this island, but was very difficult to capture alive. The Rajah, having remained for some time on board, retired with his attendants to the boat, and returned on shore, under a salute of 3 guns from the ship, which compliment he also received on coming on board. The Rajah of Pedir is related to the king of Achin, and the territory is tributary to the Achinese ruler. The population of the Pedir district, which does not extend far along the coast, but to some distance inland, is stated to be 100,000, and has several petty Rajahs tributary to it, but they appear all petty Rajahs along this coast, paying homage and tribute to the Achinese king. Often during the cool evenings, I amused myself by wandering about the extensive beach on this coast, to observe and collect such marine productions as might be interesting. A great number of dead shells strewed the beach, but living shells, or those containing the soft parts, were rare. Observing an antenna of some crustaceous animal projecting from the moist sand, left by the receding of the tide, I pulled it, and drew out 2 fine king crabs, joined together by their under surfaces, and thus united burrow in the sand. They are called Ekan Mimi by the Javanese, and on this coast they are named Moi Moi. The male is larger than the female. They are eaten by the Javanese, but on this coast they are not eaten, although the natives observe the Chinese are fond of them. The females lay their eggs in the sand after carrying them for some time, and in about the 2nd month the young are produced. These animals are perfectly harmless. They crawl rapidly, and when touched, draw the upper part of the shell a little inwards, and, as they move, the long antenna bears a resemblance to a tail. When placed on the back, they find much difficulty in regaining their natural position. Land crabs were numerous, as were also the shells of the genera Synthera, Telina, Mactra, Conus, Oliver, Cypria, Harper, Dolium, Murex, Turbo, Narita, and Dentalium. But although this was an indication of the number about the coast, yet but very few were procured in which the living animals were found. Among these were a number of the Venus and small species of Voluta. The latter buried themselves with rapidity in the sand. The natives call them Dunkin. Almost buried in a deep black mud, among which the roots of mangrove trees abounded, the trees having been cut down, I found a number of white bodies growing from a piece of rotten wood, and being each about an inch in length and 3/8 of an inch in breadth, containing a watery fluid called sepa by the natives. They were not, however, eaten or used for any purpose by them. I preserved several specimens in spirits. A great number of the paguri, hermit or soldier crabs of different sizes, were running about the beach. 2 large specimens that I found had each taken possession of the Dolium perdix, or partridge shell, to which they were firmly attached as if in their natural habitation. The crustaceous portion of these animals is of a beautiful lilac colour, the softer parts yellow, and the antennae of a dark red colour. The natives call them by the general name of sipo. The smaller kind inhabit Murissus, Trochi, Neriti, Helisus, Limni, Cerathe, and other univalve shells. In some instances, I saw large shells of harper, etc., inhabited by very small animals of this kind, moving their heavy and cumbrous dwelling slowly and with difficulty. There were some of a red and others of a sea green colour, but the larger were invariably of a beautiful lilac. May not this change of colour depend upon their age? The paguri feed upon dead animals, fish, and all kinds of offal, as well as vegetable matter, such as skins of plantains, remains of cocoa nuts, fruits, etc. I have often observed a number of these creatures of various sizes congregated about a dead and putrid fish, and it is ludicrous, on disturbing them in the midst of their feast, to see them marching away, jumbling and overturning one another in the hurry, causing a clattering noise to proceed from the collision of their burrowed coverings. And should they not be able to escape capture, they draw themselves closely into the shell, closing the aperture so firmly by crossing the claws over the entrance as to render it impossible to extract them without breaking the shell to pieces. Thus secured, they remain immovable and apparently dead, and may be kicked or thrown about without giving any indications of life. But danger past, they emerge partly from the shell as before, and move briskly away. The natives use them occasionally, but rarely, as food. It is not an improbable supposition that the ova of these curious crustaceous animals are deposited in the empty shells lying upon the beach, and the changes these crustacea undergo is one of the most interesting subjects of investigation which could engage the attention of a practical naturalist. It is a curious fact that, no matter whatever form the univalve shell may have, the posterior or softer parts of the animal inhabiting it are accommodated to it, thus causing persons not accustomed to observe the changes of natural objects to regard this as the original inhabitant, and it is oftentimes difficult to persuade them to the reverse. The posterior portion of the animal being naked, and the anterior crustaceous, the former evidently requires some protection. One morning, having previously received a general invitation, I visited the Raja at his habitation. The situation was an extensive plot of ground, containing numerous houses in the usual Malay style of building, being the residences of the Raja, his wives, and attendants. The whole enclosed by lofty waving bamboos, forming a close and impenetrable fence, and the interior planted with a number of fruit trees and flowering shrubs. The entrance was by a gateway, over which was a small room, in which His Highness receives visitors, or whiles away in a leisure hour in smoking, talking, or sleeping. I ascended to it by a bamboo ladder, and found myself in a cool but dirty room, containing a small bed, over which a mat was laid. The curtains about it seemed to have remained in ignorance, since they came from the loom of the application of water. Some carved boxes, one of which served me for a seat, a native shield, and a few other trumpery articles, constituted the furniture of the apartment. And here I was received in a cordial manner by the Rajah. His Highness was attired in a common Madras cloth sarong and sandalong, which, like the curtains, seemed never to have undergone ablution. He wore, in lieu of a turban, the usual parti-coloured Mormon's cap or kupia, which merely covered the top of his head. The personal appearance of the Rajah reminded me of the tribe of animals they abhor for uncleanness. I allude to the hog, of which he informed us there were plenty wild, if we were desirous of hunting them. Cocoa-nut water was introduced, being the usual beverage in the country, and proving both wholesome and refreshing. The cocoa palm abounds, and they have numerous varieties. The Malay name for the nut is kalapas. In the Achinese language, the tree is called ba-hu, ba signifying tree, and hu, coconut. A ripe nut, hu masa, and a green one, hu muda. This palm forms a beautiful and picturesque object in the tropical landscape. In the appendix, I purpose giving an account of this valuable, ornamental, and useful palm, and the various uses for which it is employed in the different countries where it abounds. The habitations in the Rajah's enclosure were raised from the ground, which is the usual Malay style of constructing houses, and were ascended by means of rude bamboo ladders. They are formed, for the most part, of bamboo, and thatched with palm leaves. But one of larger size and neater style was the immediate residence of the Rajah and his wives, the young Rajah having, as we were informed, 2 concubines, 18 years of age each, and a child, now 4 years old, betrothed to him as his intended wife. Near the habitations, the cocoa, plantain, orange, mango, and custard apple trees grew, shading them by the grandeur and profusion of their foliage. There was also a house, which from the commencement, being now in frame, appeared intended to be of some extent, but which had been commenced by the old Rajah not long before his death. But the building was obliged to be discontinued by the young Rajah, on his succession, from a want of the necessary funds for its construction. At one part of the enclosure a bamboo ladder ascended to a little elevation, which brought us to a plank, over which we passed into the fort adjoining the residence of the Rajah, and was mounted with several large brass guns, most of which had the arms of the East India Company upon them. The fort was built of stone, elevated about 16 or 18 feet from the ground, covered over with a thatch of palm leaves, and having a lookout house upon the summit. There were lamps, which are lighted after dark, and remained so during the night, a sentinel being also stationed there. From some large rents in the walls of the fort, it was evident that the concussion of the guns, if fired off, which they had not yet been, would bring the whole fabric down about their ears. The minister and authorities thought the same, and said a stronger fort was to be built when a sufficient number of stones calculated for the purpose could be collected. Although abundance of coconut water was given us to drink, yet nothing was offered us to eat, by which I should infer they conceived white people lived like hummingbirds upon suction. On leaving the Rajah's place, my guides took me again to the bazaar, where it appears to be accustomed to take strangers. This I attribute to their Mahometan prejudices of not being desirous of receiving Christians under their roofs. Here mats were placed, so that I could be seated and gazed at like a curious animal, by a large crowd of natives of all classes and orders, who, from the eagerness they evinced, and the crowds which they assembled around us upon these occasions, seemed to regard Europeans as curiosities. However, instead of waiting to be gazed at, I amused myself by wandering over the bazaar, which was plentifully supplied with sugar canes, plantains, rice, cucumbers, dried fish, sia, the leaf of the piper betel, the areca nut, or pinong, cut up ready for mastication, and a quantity of live stock, as small bullocks, ducks, fowls, etc., etc. From the bazaar I walked down by the banks of the river upon the raised paths which intersected the numerous marshes, which now, during the dry season, abounded in luxuriant grasses and other herbaceous plants, affording fine feeding for the numerous bullocks of the small hunchbacked Bengal breed and buffaloes which roamed about. During the rainy season, the whole of this flat is planted with rice, which, together with the scattered picturesque habitations and groups of palms and other trees, form, by their combination, a very pleasing landscape. Upon the banks of the river was acrostic humorium, or ongpi, of the natives, as well as the bar jurugu, or Acanthus illicifolius, covered with a profusion of blue flowers, and brilliant butterflies and other insects flew about the rich vegetation which was so profusely strewn about. Surrounding a hut near the river was the sekar, a species of pandanus, the younger leaves of which several women were engaged in collecting. They are bleached by soaking in water, and afterwards exposing them to the heat of the sun. Being thus prepared, they manufacture them into various kinds of coarse mats. The Thespesia populnea, profusely covered with its large yellow flowers, and called onceron by the natives, was very common about their habitations, forming usually a portion of the fence around their gardens. A leafless species of the Euphorbiaceae family, which they named Buga, was also growing plentifully in the hedges. They did not use it medicinally, but said, if the juice was taken internally, it would produce violent pain and excessive vomiting. Having arrived at a fisherman's station, we crossed over a creek in one of the large fishing boats, in which the seine was very large, and manufactured from the fibres of the trunk of a palm, which I shall hereafter have occasion to mention. This fibrous material is known by the common name of black coir. It is strong, elastic, and very durable. A number of natives were fishing upon the banks of the river with their peculiar hand nets, called niap. This net is of a similar appearance, but of course smaller, to that used in the Sarambo fishing rafts. At Manila, of which there is a very correct figure in the Voyage of La Pérouse.
Octavo, English edition.
Volume 2, page 322. On examining the contents of the baskets, which were rudely formed from the spathe of the areca palm, they were found to contain only a few small fish, prawns, and biongs, or crabs. On their success, my native attendants informed me, the fishermen depend for their daily meal. During the rice and betel nut harvest, they earn their subsistence by cutting and threshing the former, and gathering and shelling the latter. But when the season for those productions has passed, they depend upon the fish caught with the hand net as a subsistence for themselves and families. I stood by one of them to see a haul. After a short time had elapsed, the heavy net was raised, and contained only a solitary fish and a few crabs. The nets were baited with crabs' claws, tied about different parts. On a marsh near this spot, a flock of two kinds of crane was feeding. One species small and white, and named ekua. The other much larger, of a greyish colour, and named nugna nugna by the natives. Fruit was at this season scarce. A few guavas, plantains, and jack was all that could be procured. But during the season, mangoustines, a variety of plantains and bananas, oranges, pineapples, mangoes, and other tropical fruits could be procured in abundance. Having ranged about the Pedir Raja's district, near the sea coast, I returned on board in the evening with the collection I had made. Among the natives that occasionally came on board with the cargo boats, as well as those seen on shore, consisting of different races of Hindustan, Malays, etc., there were several with the African features and hair, none of whom, however, were well-formed or handsome men, but still seemed to possess great muscular power. They were of that African race designated the Black Arabs, who were shipped as seamen on board vessels at Bushire and other places in the Persian Gulf. When I was looking at this variety of the human race, one of the Raja's followers said he was the property of the Raja, and he would sell him to me if I wanted him. As I did not require a specimen of that kind, I declined this very obliging offer. The land and sea breezes were for some days very regular, and at others extremely irregular, varying also in their degree of strength. The range of the thermometer, during the short period I remained on this coast, was from 79 degrees to 88 degrees. Early one morning, a party was formed to endeavour to obtain a view of the country further inland. On landing at the village of Pedir, we were met by the old trading minister, who accompanied us. The houses of the natives were constructed of bamboo, raised, like all the Malay residences, upon strong posts, a short distance from the ground, and the ascent to the rooms above was by bamboo ladders. The habitations are covered with a thatch, formed from the leaves of different kinds of palms, and the dwellings are cool. This quality, so desirable in sultry climates, is given to them by gardens surrounding the habitations, filled with trees, imparting a refreshing verdure, and from the blossoms delightful odours were exhaled. Among the more elevated kinds were the graceful and majestic cocoa nut and the straight areca palm, Areca catechu, surmounted by its tuft of dark green foliage and its long pendant clusters of orange-coloured fruit of an oval form. The Artocarpus incisor, or jack tree, the broad-leaved plantain, the mango, orange, lime, and occasionally, but rarely, the breadfruit trees. A. integrifolia ornamented the garden. That most elegant as well as largest of the gramineous plants, the bamboo, triang, of the natives, was abundant, as fences about many of the dwellings, as well as the Erythrina corollodendron, or mankudu of the natives, the Jatropha curcus, or banawa of the natives, and in distinct clumps. The piper betel trailed up some of the trees, and the Abrus precatorius, an asagar of the natives, with its pods, containing small but beautiful crimson seeds, hung in festoons from the bushes in the jungle, and a diosma, called gropum by the natives, was abundant and fragrant. The manihot, Jatropha manihot, was also seen, and although I was informed the root was prepared and eaten, the shrub did not seem to be extensively planted. The carambola trees, Averroa carambola, were numerous and called boslemang. A quantity of the fruit was observed laid upon a raised bamboo platform, spread out to dry in the sun, and natives appeared fond of eating them in a raw state, as well as using them in many of their curries and other dishes. About some of the native habitations, that large and elegant palm, the Berossus gometus of Loureiro, the Sagarus pinnatus of the Batavian transactions, and the Cleophora of Gertner, was planted. It is Anau of the Sumatrans, was called at this place Eju, and Do by the Javanese. It is valued on account of excellent toddy being extracted from it, but more especially for the black fibres collected from the trunk, about the bases of the petioles of the fronds, which fibrous substance resembles somewhat in its appearance, as well as elasticity, horsehair. And it is highly esteemed for the manufacture of rope used for their seines, vessels, etc. The very thick fibres, the natives say, the Mormen resident here uses as pens, and call them pure edu. It is probably the same tree from which the fibres, called cabo negro by the Spaniards, are procured at Manila, and from which they also manufacture rope. We continued our ramble over a fine plain, terminated in the distance by palms, bamboos, the broad-leaved plantain, and other elegant trees were seen, ornamenting some lonely habitation, the roof just appearing above the dense foliage. The plain at one season of the year is covered with rice fields, but was now dried up. The stubble of the former harvest remained, and the whole was covered by an abundance of herbage, affording feeding for herds of cattle. A number of various species of grilli were hopping about the fields, and were caught by the native boys for my entomological collection. They called them, in the language of the country, darua, and these insects are eaten by the natives. End of chapter 20.